Hi, I'm Marge Kirchner. Actually, my given name was Margaret Helen Kirchner. Margaret for my maternal grandmother, who I never met. She died a long time before I was born. And Helen for my paternal grandmother. I got the name Marge when I was in high school. Somebody just suddenly started calling me that, and I liked it a lot better than being called Midge, which I had been called from the time I was very young. And this seemed to be a name that I really liked, and therefore everybody knows me as Marge Kirchner. I live in Quorum, New York, and have lived there for about 22 years. My partner, whose name is Patricia, and I have a very interesting life there. One of the things that we absolutely love to do is to take care of our two little Shih Tzus, who are perhaps as much like children as anyone else's children could possibly be. We are both very, very different in many ways, and in many ways we're very similar. She happens to be a psychotherapist. I ended my career as a counselor. So that we have a great deal in common that way. However, right now she's working with the leatherback turtles in Costa Rica on an expedition for Earthwatch, and that's something I would absolutely never, ever do. I am a homebody to the word go.
Where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, at Williamsburg Maternity Hospital. I was the daughter of Emma and Charles Kirchner. I have two brothers, older brothers, one 5 years older, the other 3 years older. And I had a foster brother who was 13 years younger than I was.
Tell me a little bit about the family, about the brothers, what they do, what they're like.
My oldest brother, it's kind of difficult to talk about this because I really have very little communication with anyone. Not being in a traditional lifestyle, I have been very much put aside by my family. However, what I do know about my older brother is that he is retired from the police department in Florida. He has a wife and 3 daughters, 2 of whom have children. I have the only time I've ever really seen him in the past 20 years was at my other brother's funeral, which was just a couple of years ago. And he was someone who I had periodic contact with during my life, most of which because his son, my nephew, and I are extremely close. It's very interesting that I would be close with my nephew, although his father and I were not friendly at all. He was a retired Army person. He was in the Army for 30 years and then went into his own business and did very well for himself. Unfortunately, he developed a glioblastoma and died within a couple of months of his diagnosis. Other than that, my youngest brother, who I really consider to be my brother, my sweet brother, John, died unfortunately when he was 24 years old. And he was, without a doubt, very much like my child, having been 13 years older than he was. So losing him was a very great setback in my life. His death followed, unfortunately, the deaths of my parents. So by the time I was 31 years old, I was parentless and then lost him several years later. So it's been a difficult life that way, but in other ways, it's been a wonderful life. Pat's family is absolutely incredibly wonderful and are very open and kind, and you name the word, and everything family could ever possibly be. But beyond that, my best friend is my cousin Berta, who's my mother's sister's daughter. She was born 10 months younger than I, and we always say that we have been friends from the time I was 10 months old. And we are best friends. The earliest childhood memories I have are of wonderful times in Brooklyn, playing all kinds of games in the street, roller skating constantly, begging every year for a bicycle and being told that I couldn't have a bicycle because we lived in Brooklyn and it was too dangerous. I have wonderful, wonderful memories of going to Mineola, where my cousin, who, as I said before, was my best friend and still is, where her family lived. And I would spend summer vacations with her and her family. And it was just an amazing, wonderful time for me. Probably one of the greatest memories I have occurred when I was, I guess, about 7 years old and Berta was 6. Our grandfather, our paternal grandfather, decided he would take us to see Hopalong Cassidy. And Hopalong Cassidy was at Nam Loge's department store, downtown Brooklyn. And we waited, and all of a sudden, he just showed up. And this was the greatest thrill that you could ever imagine. And for some reason or other, he decided to pick the two of us out, came over, put his arms around us, and gave me a kiss on my cheek. And I thought this was the greatest possible thing that ever could happen.
This for people who are watching and don't know, this was like a great hero to all of us growing up at this time. Hopalong Cassidy. I mean, he was like a superhero almost.
He was absolutely a superhero, and for some reason or other, I liked him a lot more than Roy Rogers.
Talk about your mom, your mother, and her background, the things she liked to do. A little family history, if you can fill it in.
My mother was a woman who was probably the most giving, caring individual I had ever known. She was thoughtful, kind, caring. She was very religious, religious isn't a good word. She was a very spiritually minded woman who always was interested in helping others. My childhood was filled with going with her to people's homes where she would read to people who were blind or would write letters for them. This continued when we moved to Long Island. It continued well up until I would assume that the last time she went to a nursing home to read to people was the afternoon of the day she had her stroke. She just never, ever ceased in her desire to help others. She was a good mother, a loving mother, and one of the greatest bakers in the entire world. I frequently say, when people say to me, what would you like your heaven to be like? And I always say, I'd like it to be in a bakery. It was wonderful to wake up in the morning and have the smell of yeast breads and rolls. And
did you take after your father or your mother? Who, I know you have combinations of both, but who do you see was the real role model for you in terms of what you did with your life?
I really can't say that I took after either one of them more than the other. I certainly have been a person who is very concerned with other people's rights, with my own rights, with caring, and I very much am a spiritually minded person. I certainly got that from my mother. My dad was lots and lots of fun. I have a fun-filled side of me that very few people get to see, and I know that that comes absolutely from him. He also taught me so many little things, everything from wrapping a package correctly to be sent in the mail, all the way up to little tiny things you might need to do around the house just in case. So he taught me how to fix little electrical things or plumbing things or things like that. My father was an electrician with the Long Island Railroad. However, you name it and he knew it. My mother was a stay-at-home mom for a long time, but then also worked at various things, when I was growing up. And when we moved to Long Island, I was 16, just turning 16 years old. And my mother began working in a bakery downtown in Lake Ronkonkoma, which eventually was owned by my oldest brother. So she worked for him. And she was one of those German ladies who always had a handkerchief coming out of her uniform pocket. And she was the quintessential mother as well as woman working in a bakery.
Marge, one of the earliest memories you have of your dad?
One of the earliest memories I have of my dad is that for fun, he used to, on a Sunday, take me to New York City. We'd walk around Lower Manhattan, took me into Trinity Church, would take me through Wall Street, showed me the building where Washington took the oath. And then for fun, we would always take the Staten Island ferry for a ride. And for the nickel, right. And on the way back, we would always stop at an ice cream parlor and have a black and white soda. Mm-hmm.
Now, you've mentioned your brothers, but where were you in the birth order?
I was, my oldest brother was 5 years older. My next brother was 3 years older. Then I came. And as I said, I had a foster brother, but he came when I was 13. Actually, I was 12 years older than he was. He was a year when we got him.
So you became the nurturer.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Is there something that each one of your brothers taught you? Is there something you can say you learned? Obviously, you've taught them a thing or two, but is there anything that you picked up from them along the way? And you mentioned the struggle with family.
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not choices, orientation.
Orientation.
Mm-hmm. I would say that my oldest brother taught me about caring very much for children, little children, and making sure that they were safe. My next brother, especially as a child, taught me a great deal about playing marbles, cards, trading comic books, flipping baseball cards, you name it.
Okay. Among the adult influences early on in your life, were there other people besides your mother and father that really had a significant role in your upbringing and nurturing?
Probably the person who comes to mind immediately was a woman I called Aunt Lydia. Her name was Lydia Walters. She was my Sunday school teacher when I was very young. She had a class called the Little Tots. I stayed in the Little Tots until I was 12 years old because I didn't want to leave her. So what happened is I eventually became her assistant. She was a woman who would take me to New York to go to Radio City Music Hall. I would just go to her house and she would tell me stories about her life or about her family. She was much, much older than my parents were. She was like the grandmother I had never had. And I guess after that, the other person who had the most influence on my life was my Aunt V, who is Berta's mother. Berta always looked to my mother as, wow, what a mother. And I always looked to her mother as, wow, what a mother. And yet both of them were really very kind, loving, and spiritually minded people.
Now, you mentioned the grandparents that you never had. Is that because you never got a chance to meet your grandparents?
My mother's mother died at age 42, and that was several years before I was born. I did know her father, and I guess he died when I was about 6 or 7. He was a funny, funny man. I can remember him doing things like, well, one day he decided that he would ask the greengrocer who would come with his horse and carriage if he could borrow his horse. And he decided to ride the horse into a bar and say, set me up one. just like they would if you were watching Hopalong Cassidy. Berta lived with him. She and her parents lived with him, and he spent lots of time with her and with me. He would take us to the movies a lot, and Berta always wanted to be a tap dancer. So before the movie would start, he would put her up on the stage, and she would just tap dance and tap dance and tap dance at all age 5 or 6 or whatever, and people in the audience would just applaud before the movie would start.
Yeah, oh, that's wonderful. Do you have any contact with your high school friends, people that go way back with you?
I have only one person that I remain in contact with, and over the years it's become less and less, although we certainly do contact each other a couple of times a year. She lives in Delaware and has from the time she graduated from college. When her family still lived in New York, every time she came to visit, we of course would get together. But other than that, we haven't really seen each other. We've spoken a couple of times. She was a great high school friend. A part of it, I lived in the city until I was almost 16. So when I came to Long Island, I was only in high school for 2 years. So she was my friend from high school, Gwen. She's a lovely, lovely woman.
Do you remember your first paying job, Marge?
Well, if you want to talk about my first paying job, sure. My first paying job was babysitting. And oh, did I ever. I think I started when I was about 9 years old, and I babysat all the time. But my first real paying job was when I worked in the bakery where my mother worked during the summer in Ronkonkoma, between my junior and senior years, during the summer. And I would fill in here and there. After that, you name it, anything that would give me money so that I could get through college. I washed hair in a beauty salon. I tutored children who needed help with reading. I tutored someone who needed to pass his French course in college. On and on and on. Every little job you can imagine.
Now, the family was large enough that I'm sure that the gathering around holidays was quite a gathering. Were there certain holidays that were more important in your family than others?
Actually, in my family, there wasn't a holiday that was not celebrated. Being an incredible baker, my mother felt that every holiday needed to be celebrated with a cake that marked the holiday. So we would have a shamrock on St. Patrick's Day. We would have a lamb for Easter. On and on and on. We could have a cake in the shape of an American flag for Flag Day, a pumpkin for Halloween, you name it. But as far as big celebrations, they were always Easter, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. And our birthdays were extremely important. They were celebrated with family and were days that were set aside as very, very special days. Something that I'll just tell you very interestingly, my birthday is June 15th. And this year it happened to rain. It was the third time that I remember in my entire life that it rained on my birthday. So when I taught, we always made sure that if my birthday was during the week, that's the day we'd have our picnic.
It sounds almost idyllic. What kind of a kid were you growing up? Describe yourself,
Oh boy. I was a kid who loved to go to school. I loved to read. I loved to write. I loved playing with my dolls. I loved roller skating all over the place. My parents did not drive, so everything that we did was either by subway or whatever, or really right within the couple of blocks where I lived. And I'm sure that contributed to my being a very home-based person. I liked very much to help the kids in the neighborhood who were having trouble with their studies and things like that. I ran around a lot, but I also was a very, very nervous child. I had rheumatic fever when I was 7 and was in bed for almost a year and was very frightened by that experience. And so as a result, I always kind of watched myself and the things that I did. So I did spend a great deal of my childhood very nervous, and that kind of grew into adulthood anxiety.
Now, you mentioned the dolls that you love to play with. If I just say the word toys, what comes to mind?
Christmas, dolls. I didn't know till much later that the reason the second present I opened was always a box of clothing for my dolls. And I always thought Santa Claus was incredible. How could he have known what kind of a doll and to have all of these great clothes? But what I found out later was that my mother would buy my doll probably in August or September, send it down to a very distantly related cousin of hers, who I called Aunt Lily, although I never met her, who lived in Maryland, and she would just make pinafores and dresses and overalls and sweaters and hats and you name it. So that's what really comes to mind first.
Did you have a favorite, or do you now have a favorite season of the year? And has it always been your favorite?
Spring has always been my favorite season. I love the idea of rebirth. I think the idea of rebirth of the environment is incredibly wonderful, but I also think that rebirth of a person's spirit is also wonderful.
There are aromas associated with spring, but there are also aromas associated with the bakery. So I suspect that there are certain aromas that will trigger memories for you that are particularly enjoyable when you experience them. Do you recall anything about your early school years, like the first day of school, or a particular graduation, or an event in your elementary years?
In my elementary years, I went to PS 137 in Brooklyn, which is the school that my mother also attended, and another person you interviewed was Florence Corkery, and Florence Corkery and my mother were very best friends. And I only found that out after I was teaching, and she happened to come and pick up her daughter one day and said, "She looks like Emma Kirchner." And that's how we found out. But anyway, going back, yes, I went to the same school that they went to. Playground was a tar surface. And if it were raining, we'd have to go in the basement. And Mrs. Lang would say, "I want to hear a pin drop." And she would hold a pin. And here's all of these children lined up in the basement. And she would drop a pin. And if she couldn't hear it, she'd drop it again. So, but I really loved school. My second grade teacher was Miss Goldstein, was just absolutely charming and wonderful. My fourth grade teacher had the same birthday that I had, and on my birthday I came in and she had drawn in colored chalks a birthday cake with both of our names on it. I thought that was the greatest thing that could ever have happened. I really enjoyed my elementary years very much.
What were the schools that you went to in the order in which you went to them?
I started at PS 137 in Brooklyn. From there, I went to junior high school 73. From there, I went to, it's interesting, a school that was half on the Brooklyn side, half on the Queens side. You went to the Brooklyn side for a good glass of water, and that was Franklin K. Lane High School, but only for a year. Then we moved to Long Island, and I went to Sachem High School, was in their second graduating class. Then I had a very great honor to have been chosen to be the first student to attend Suffolk Community College. And there were lots and lots of newspaper articles, and I was interviewed by very many people, and this was an incredible honor that I really never quite understood why it was passed on to me, but I was called and asked if I would, be their first student. So I was there for 2 years. Following that, I went to Adelphi and finished my bachelor's degree. And I did my master's work at Hofstra University in counseling. And then I did some postmaster's work just here and there. Many different schools, Long Island University, Post, you name it. I went to a lot of different places.
Did you, was there a particular person who inspired you to go into the field that you went into? Was there someone that either a teacher or some other adult, or is it that came from within you?
I think it just came from within me. I'm sure that having had Aunt Lydia as a Sunday school teacher and having had such wonderful second grade experience with Miss Goldstein, I'm sure they contributed. But Berta and I always talked that, by the time we were in second grade, she knew she wanted to be a nurse. I knew I wanted to be a teacher, and we never, ever moved from that career path.
Mm-hmm. What were your favorite subjects while you were in school?
I liked math a great deal. My favorite, however, was writing, and I continue to write.
Do you write now?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm.
Prose, poetry, both?
Both. Primarily prose, but both.
When and how did you first come to Brentwood?
That's one of the sweetest memories of my life. I was at Adelphi and was needing to do my student teaching. And I was chosen to go to the Brentwood district. And I met, talk about quintessential, the quintessential teacher of all time, Florence Dornan, who taught 4th grade and who was my cooperating teacher. Interestingly enough, my first day at work, it was in February of 1964. That very first day, there were 2 new people. I was one. And the second one was a woman who was going to be fulfilling someone else's contract who had left mid-year. And that person was Roseanne DiPietro. And so she and I became fast friends because we both really didn't know what we were doing in the beginning. And it's very interesting how her life went on to be so incredibly influential in so many ways. And certainly having been married to Guy, that influence was there also.
But it was primarily because of your cooperating teacher?
That's correct. She was really incredibly wonderful. I think about things like, well into my teaching career, they started talking about we have to teach children close comprehension. Well, Florence Dornan every morning would write a story, and it was closed comprehension. This was 1964. I had a wonderful experience with her. I loved working there. Art Brieger was the principal. However, at the end of the year, when I graduated from college, I really wanted to go back and teach at my home district, which was Sachem. And I worked there for 2 years and then said, I have to go back. There's something about Brentwood that is so incredibly wonderful. There were always innovative ideas. There were always people willing to help you. There were always administrators who were there, who were your friends. And so I called up Art Brieger and I said, Art, I'm ready to come back. Are you ready to have me? And he said, what grade do you want? And that was my interview. And I came back to Loretta Park, where I had done my student teaching. And I taught 4th grade that year and continued to teach either 4th, 5th, or 6th for the remaining years that I was a teacher. So that I started then in Brentwood teaching officially in 1966. and ended in February of '86 when I became one of the first elementary counselors.
Now, you obviously had, you were young, a lot of young teachers starting out at the time. Who was beginning with you at that point? Who were some of your people you were?
I don't know that I remember very many people. The first couple of years, I certainly do remember Audrey Allgrove. I certainly remember Sally Karp, Morty Pitt, people like that. But I think that mostly the people that I tended to get to know quite well were a few years after that, when Tracy Zimmerman Jack now came in, Myra Feeney, Judy Butenkamp, Paul Cohen. There
was a lot of turnover too at first.
There was a lot of turnover, and that's why I say, that when I got to know Tracy and Myra and a few other people, we were really the crew that stayed on for a very long time. We're very, very close.
You had a job description, but you also had your own purpose for being in the classroom, and obviously that changed if you went from a classroom teacher into the guidance field. But Marge, how would you define your purpose for getting up every day and going to work in Brentwood?
I don't know that I would ever really classify myself as solely a teacher for those years. I think I was always a counselor. People came to me from the time I was a kid seeking advice. And even in my teaching career, Dr. Brigger would come to me and say, Marge, I'm having a problem. Maybe you can give me some insight as to help a certain child. Later on, when Andy Levito was my principal, he would do the same thing. I think what really got me going was the thought that I could truly make a difference in a child's life.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to go back where we were before because we left that area very quickly. How did you meet your partner? When did you meet?
We met over 20 years ago. However, did not really begin a serious relationship until maybe 8 or 9 years ago. She is somebody who's just, she's wonderful.
Was this a social connection or was it a work-related connection?
It was a social connection.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
The first time I met her, she was giving a workshop on autonomous relationships, and she was giving it at Stony Brook University. And I went to hear the lecture, and I thought, wow, this person knows what she's talking about. So as a result, I got to know her.
You have always been a very open person about your life. How has Brentwood affected the way you are with your openness about your life? Do you think that has it affected you one way or another, working in Brentwood and with the colleagues that you've worked with there?
Certainly in the beginning, just because Patricia and I have been together only 9 years certainly doesn't mean that I haven't, lived a lesbian lifestyle my entire life. However, in the beginning, I certainly was a lot less prone to let others know about who I was. However, very soon into maybe, the 8th or 9th year of my teaching, I said, wait a minute, I am me first, and I will put myself first. Who I am is important to me. I am a good human being. I am an excellent teacher. I'm a fine friend. What's important about me is that I continue those things. And I took a very important stand with myself that I would not behave the way a school district, a person, a principal, whatever, wanted me to, because my best motto is to thine own self be true. And I would not have been true to myself. And I always found it very sad that many of my friends spent their entire careers hiding, afraid that they would be fired. I was never afraid I was going to be fired because I was a good teacher and a good person.
Well, I ask you that question, and I appreciate your answer, because while our culture does, uh, how do I put it? Our culture values difference and uniqueness.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, we're very afraid in this culture about people who appear to be different.
Mm-hmm.
And I say appear to be because when you get to know somebody, as you obviously have allowed your colleagues in Brentwood to get to know you, you get to know the person, as you said yourself, who you really
Mm-hmm.
are.
Mm-hmm.
And we've always talked about how supportive we have felt about being in Brentwood,
Mm-hmm.
the family, extended family. So one family that you had more difficulty with, I guess, the other family has been there for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's talk about the BTA or the
Mm-hmm.
organization. Were you a member of the organization right from the beginning?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
now that's consistent with your philosophy too, about being honest about your positions and you're taking a stand on things. There were times that you didn't, in the early years, you didn't even have tenure. And I suspect that you were the same person before tenure that you were after tenure.
I would think so. Yeah. I certainly was with BTA when Jack was there. I've always admired Jack and Dot Zuckerman. I always felt that their involvement in our school district has been just primary to its growth as far as unions are concerned. I find it an absolute joy that as a retiree that I'm on the executive board of R.O.B.S because I can work so closely with them again. During my time with BTA, I did everything from being a delegate to a chief delegate and was on many, many committees, the curriculum advisory committee, elementary planning committee, and so forth and so on. But there was a period of time, and I think it was really in the beginning that I mostly was involved with the union. After that, I kind of backed away and got involved with other kinds of things.
What did you get involved in? Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll come back to the union.
I became I got very involved and at the building level in being the building chairperson. I was the liaison from the staff to the principal. I also they used to call me the sunshine lady because year after year, of course, I had that position. I also was I was going to school a lot and taking a lot of classes. I didn't have a lot of extra time. So a lot of what I did was personally moving ahead academically so that I didn't have the same amount of time to devote as I had at an earlier age.
When you finished your formal education, how many credits do you have now? Or what kind of credentials did you finally establish?
That's interesting. I have master's plus, I believe it's 33. I was going for master's plus 45 when I found out that you had to go master's plus 60, and I said, not going to do it. However, I feel very strongly that education doesn't just happen in a classroom. Education happens every single day of your life if you're open to it. And I dare say I've learned a lot more from the people I know than from sitting in classrooms.
The activities which you got involved in, is there anything else you want to add to what you've already said, or the projects, or the not just the organizational, but the things with kids that you were involved in? Is there anything else that you want to focus on? Because otherwise I'll bring you back to the BTA and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Well, as a classroom teacher, I think probably my greatest year of teaching actually was 2 years. We all began the fourth grade school year. There were, I believe, 4 teachers teaching fourth grade that year, and we all had, I don't know, maybe, 20, 22 kids in our class or something. And in each class, there were children that were very, very deficit academically as well as emotionally. And this was way, way, way before the advent of special education as it is today. And I had an idea after about 6 weeks of hearing everybody complain in the faculty room, including myself, about, wow, this is really hard, that I would take those kids identified as having academic and social and emotional issues into one classroom, as long as the classroom did not have more than 16 students, and that I would be their teacher. It was approved. The other classes obviously had to become larger, but the teachers were fine with that because I was taking the kids they did not prize. What happened was the first week of school, I kind of got a feeling for what was happening, and I realized that most of the children, although in the fourth grade, were on a first grade reading level and were subject to having to read from a first grade reader. And I took those readers and I made a very public stand with the children of putting them in a closet and locking them and saying, we will not use that. We're going to learn to read in other ways. We had circle chats where we would talk about things that were bothering us. I can remember feeling a great deal of satisfaction one day when there was a knock at the teacher's room door when my children were at music. And Tim McGlasky was at the door, and he said, Miss Kirchner, I have to have a circle right now, right now. There are things going on in the music room. I can't stand. I'm feeling bad. Please, can we meet right now? And I knew that what we were doing was important. At the end of that school year, I proposed to the principal that I would keep the children for another year because they were making incredible progress. And by the end of the second year, I can say with a great deal of self-satisfaction and joy that they were probably no more than a year behind. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. We did everything. In Lincoln's birthday, we built a log cabin out of a big refrigerator box and made all these logs to go on it and bring it down to first grade so that they could play with it. And we made stew for something or other. I guess. Oh, we're talking about the 70s, mid 70s.
This is yet another one of the miracles that happened in Brentwood, and the dedication that people like yourself brought to your work that made these things happen.
I dare say that teaching them was what I consider to be real teaching and real exposing of children to many, many things.
Dangerous stuff.
Absolutely.
Were there times during your tenure of service that you were more active with the union or more active with the BTA than at other times?
I would just say that from the beginning, when I first was a BTA delegate, was on the elections committee and things like that, I can't say that I was ever truly involved. I became a delegate. I became a chief delegate, but it was never my passion.
Understood.
Mm-hmm.
But you were active as a delegate, as a chief delegate. You attended meetings of the House, etc. And
yes.
To that extent, were involved.
Mm-hmm.
Well, were you ever involved? You mentioned your passion was elsewhere. I understand that part of it. But were there times when you found that your own personal definition of union has changed over the years? Or you mentioned Dot and Jack's role. they come from a particular place in the union movement in this country and still carry that with them to this day.
Yeah.
Has that changed at all for you, or do you still have the same vision?
I've had a great deal of difficulty in Brentwood with the fact that the people who have led the union eventually led the district. I have found that to be something that's been very difficult for me to understand and to accept. I very much continue to feel a great sense of awe and a great sense of just looking up to Jack, and Jack particularly for beginning his union involvement, sticking with it even through thick and thin, and especially during times when things were difficult.
Now you mentioned the Roseanne DiPietro connection before, and so you were a witness to history as Guy rode up through the ranks and became superintendent. And he was probably the first.
He was.
To do that, to take that, not just in Brentwood, but probably on Long Island, without a doctorate even.
Right.
To accomplish that. But what you're pointing out is that you win something when you do that, but you also lose.
I think so. For me, there was loss. For me, I felt very strongly that I didn't really know what the difference was between union and administration. I didn't feel that as much when Guy took over, probably because he was the first and I didn't really know what was happening at the time. But later on, I felt it a great deal and continue to.
Maybe this speaks to the point of why the majority of the electors don't bother to go to polls on election day.
Could very well be.
There's a human lack of difference in the two offerings. What, among all your professional accomplishments, can you say you've been the most proud? And you mentioned some Lollapaloozas as you taught, so that in itself gives you reason to be proud. But does anything else come to mind when I ask that question?
Well, I certainly can point to the big things, deciding on what a theme for a graduation would be, planning it and going ahead and doing things like that. And there were many, many things along those lines that I did that I'm proud of. However, I think my most pride came in that little child whose eyes suddenly would light up, or a child when I began counseling who would come in and suddenly feel the comfort of being able to talk about very, very painful issues in their lives. That's where I felt the most proud.
That's a very human thing.
Yeah.
At some point, you said, okay, it's time. I think it's time. I have to start thinking about making a decision to do something else now with my life. And so the idea of retirement either thrust itself into your consciousness or you were ready to receive it. And how to describe the sequence of events that led to letting go?
Actually, that's another one of those, I don't know how this happened, routines that happened in my life. I've been a person who has had a multiplicity of musculoskeletal problems my entire life. And after breaking my back in 1996 and getting over that, in 1999, I was in a car accident. Somebody came and smashed me in the back, and I wound up having a great deal of difficulty with my foot and my leg. And as the year wore on, I thought, I just can't stand this anymore. Something's got to get better here. And I never once thought about retirement. And one day in April, I said to myself, boy, this foot is really killing me. What am I doing standing in the hall? This is kind of crazy. maybe I should retire. I was already 57 years old. It wasn't that I had to wait for a birthday. And I was just a few days away from the wonderful program that Brentwood puts on every year for people who want to retire. So I called up and asked if I could come, and decided this is it, folks. Called up my accountant, and I said, I need to make an appointment with you. I want you to go over some figures with me after I had already had a very quick turnaround with having an appointment, a video conference with somebody from Albany to know exactly what I would be getting in retirement. And I asked him, I said, John, can I retire? He said, Marge, in a second. I said, fine, the papers are going in tomorrow. And they did. So they planned a retirement party within a month, and that was it.
And for your first year in the classroom in Brentwood, you made how much?
$5,200. I took a $300 cut from coming from Sachem. But I really wanted to come to Brentwood.
Before that?
Yes. Mm-hmm. But I drove a brand new convertible.
What's the total number of years that you taught or were in service?
35 years. 33 in Brentwood.
And since you retired, which was what date now?
It was in June of 1999.
Okay, and since that time, tell us what you've been doing.
Well, I think the first...
And what you'd like to do.
And what I'd like to do. The first thing that I did was sit back for a month or so and say, I can't believe this has happened. And then something that happened that took me on a path that I never really knew I would ever go on was that Pat, for my retirement gift, had a beautiful, beautiful pond put in our yard with a berm around it and plantings. And I became very involved with gardening. Never, ever in a million years thought I would. Always loved having plants around, liked putting little pansies out in the summer and so forth. But I'm talking about serious stuff now. And this has become much, much larger. Every year it gets bigger. And in fact, a year and a half ago, we built a larger garden further back in the yard, which is becoming an English cottage garden that I have really enjoyed immensely. So that's been something I never expected would happen. I have been a part of a journaling workshop. I have been part of a writing workshop that continues, that is extremely important to me. I'm chairperson of the prayer circle at my church. I am also, I attend, one of my favorite things to do is on Wednesday mornings, I go to a group called WOW, Women on Wednesdays. And that's at my church, and we meet every Wednesday morning. And I guess I'm still the youngest woman who goes. And the women are much, much older. They are very, very bright. They're very with it. They're very involved. And I find I learn so much from being with them. It's just such an important part of my life. So I do that. And something that takes a great deal of my time, my life, and Pat's life is Snuggles, age 3, Suki, age 1, who are just absolutely delightful little Shih Tzus who are as precious as they could be.
You and Pat have a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. Do you have any immediate plans for the future?
Well, Pat has a plan that would like to be implemented in the next month, and that is to move to Florida. My plan is to never move to Florida. So that is something that definitely we're going to have to come to some kind of a conclusion about. I think what we're talking about now that will probably happen is that we both will be snowbirds for a little while, but I think she'll be a snowbird longer than I will.
Is Pat still practicing?
Yes, she is.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a practice that can be moved.
It is a practice that could be moved. Yes.
The nature of her skill and her experience.
Mm-hmm. The problem with that, however, is that if we became snowbirds, you don't get a patient, a client that will see you for 3 or 4 months. Yeah. Psychotherapy takes a very long time.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You write, therefore you read.
Mm-hmm.
What's a powerful book that you've read in your life, or one of the books that jumps out of your memory just now when I ask you about an important book in your life?
An important book in my life. I could go all the way up. Chicken Little, when I was very, very young. And I was in the play in 1st grade, and my father would always say, "The sky is falling, the sky is falling." Daddy Longlegs, when I was in 6th grade, and on to all of the Carolyn Keene mysteries and Nancy Drew books. It went up to William Goldman's book, and I cannot remember the name, Boys and Girls Together, which I absolutely adored. The Bible has always been an important book in my life. I could probably point out a million others if I could bring them to mind right now. The latest book I read that was incredibly wonderful was The Lovely Bones, which I thought was just absolutely wonderful.
You sure answered that question. Besides Hopalong Cassidy, have you had any other heroes in your life?
If I had any other heroes, most of my heroes, I think, are people who I know personally. I'm not a person who finds a film star or a television personality and think that this is the greatest person who ever lived, although I do think that Katharine Hepburn has amazing talent and I admire her so much. But I would think mostly they are people that I know, and I would say the person who I admire the most is my cousin Berta.
Really? Okay.
She's an incredible human being. She's a lovely woman.
Your parents certainly sounded heroic to me the way you did.
They certainly were.
Marge, what do you think you have missed most from the active service that you rendered to Brentwood?
I think the thing that I miss the most is my involvement with the people that I knew who were so important to me. Fortunately, I've maintained a relationship with Juana Perez, who I thought was just an incredible human being. I loved working for her. I continue to see Judy Butenkamp, who's been my friend for so many years. So I think it mostly has to do with people and not just the adults. Certainly the children who came, and those kids who suddenly I saw a little light go on, or somebody who knew they could come to me for a hug when things were really hard.
And throughout your professional life, that probably describes the thing that has given you the most pleasure, that seeing that and experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
If your life, this is an unfair question to ask, but I ask it anyway because some people have an answer for it. If your life were to be lived over, are there any choices that you would have made or things you would have done differently? Are there any paths that you might have pursued instead of what you pursued? Were there any other competing interests in your life that you didn't have time for? That, gee, if I only had time, I'd like to go back and do that again.
Well, when I was probably in 8th grade, I thought, gee, maybe someday I'll be a psychologist. And as I got older, I thought, oh, I don't think I'm smart enough to be a psychologist. I don't know that I can ever have that happen. And in retrospect, I'm very glad I never did pursue that, because what I did pursue was so much more fulfilling, I think. The only thing that I might have changed is something that I'm not sure that I could have, because it was a part of my life that just suddenly came. And that was, I would not have spent my life as anxious as I spent my life.
Is there anything that you would like to have accomplished that there wasn't time to complete?
No, I don't think so. I think I've done everything that I really have wanted to do when I wanted to do it. Doesn't mean that there aren't more things, but no, I know that what I have done has been very important for me.
Advice for the newcomers, the new kids on the block, the new teachers, the new counselors, the beginning generation of people who are now taking our places.
Dress professionally. You get so much more respect. Don't become the pal immediately. Become the teacher first, because if you become the teacher first, the reins can always be let out and always be brought back in, and the pal can come later, and the child will continue to have respect for you.
We're coming close to the end of our time together, unless there are things that we haven't discussed yet or we haven't mentioned. And I'm going to throw that to you and say, ask if there's anything that we have yet to touch upon.
I'm sure that I'll think of a million things when I leave here.
Always happens. What about just the subject, Brentwood?
What comes to mind when I hear Brentwood?
Yeah.
What comes to mind for me is a place that does not have the respect that it needs to have. When people say, "Where did you work?" and you say Brentwood, "Oh my God, how could you have worked there?" And my response to them was, "You have no idea what an incredibly wonderful place it was. A place where not only your own ideas were important, but that there were innovative techniques, innovative ideas that came along all the time. We were the people who put things into practice." And I grew up in a family where I never knew who was going to be at the dinner table. I never knew what ethnicity, what racial background, whatever was going to be there. So when people say to me, "Oh my God, how could you have worked with all of those kids who, were not the lily white children that they worked with?" my response was, I worked with children. That's what was more important.
The future is, in some ways, is very different from the past that we have known. Brentwood has been changing. As you left in '99, it was already going through changes that had occurred since I left in '92. Do you have any concerns for the kids, for the staff, for the system?
I absolutely do. Those of you who read my article in the last R.O.B.S newsletter will know that. I think that we, not just in Brentwood, but in education, I would say in New York State, but now it seems to be nationally, have become so involved in testing children that we have not become involved in educating them. We have not become involved in helping them to be human beings who are caring and careful and loving. They've become nothing more than kids who have to take tests and teachers who have to teach for tests. I find that absolutely appalling.
And the remedy, therefore, would be?
The remedy would be to go back to the old times. And I know a lot of people would say that, but I think the remedy really needs to be a focus on a child and not on a test.